Between daily training, constant checkups, physical and psychotherapy, and the lengthy writing of an apparently incredibly detailed report, as well as random appointments and talks with the higher-ups involved in the chaos, it seemed that everything was suddenly requiring James's attention now that he started to settle back into life amongst humans. This meant that unless you were directly involved in any of these daily activities, it was hard to get a hold of him at most times. This continued even into the late night, because with his tight schedule, he either stayed up longer than most or was fast asleep within mere seconds of coming back from his busy day. And then, at precisely 6:30, Earth General Time or EGT, which was the time that the routine of the entire ship was designed for, he'd be back at the morningly training. A rhythm that wasn't quite so easy to uphold for anyone who hadn't grown up with it. That way, despite him technically being there all the time, it still felt like he wasn't actually around all that much. At least if you weren't either the Admiral, one of his doctors, or part of his old team who was involved in these same occupational rotations, as he was at least twice a day. Of course, everyone else also had things they were busy with, but nobody quite to the same extent. Shida, for example, had managed to at least finish the ever-important first part of her application, to the point where she could actually start the process. For this, she had once again been called into the Admiral's office personally early in the morning. Of course, this was pretty out of the ordinary, as such trivial matters were usually a huge waste of time for someone holding such a high rank. But then again, this entire situation was out of the ordinary. Slightly nervous, but nowhere near as much as the first time she had entered the surprisingly small room, Shida sat in her seat, waiting quietly while Admiral Krieger made sure that everything was up to code within her application. Due to the number of forms involved, it took her some time, and so Shida had to try and find a way to avoid starting to fidget with her hands, or otherwise seeming unnecessarily or disrespectfully distracted. She could already feel her tail inadvertently trying to move around, despite it being pretty much trapped between her lower back and the backrest of the unfortunately designed chair. She figured that the most considerable thing she could most likely do to keep herself somewhat occupied, while still seeming professional, was to take a closer look at the things that the Admiral had on display, specifically to decorate her office. After all, if she deliberately put them out for show, it was unlikely that she would mind someone looking at them, right? In the end, she'd had little interest in the plants placed at the edges of the room, and she also couldn't make much out of the books that were prominently displayed, since she couldn't even start to decipher any of the titles written on their backs in any of Earth's languages. So she mostly ended up looking at the pictures, displayed all around in big and small frames that projected them one after the other on flat screens, without background lighting. They imitated printed paper so well that she'd had admittedly not even noticed them being digital during her first visit, especially since they only seemed to rotate through the different images quite slowly, changing only every few minutes or so. The returning theme of the displayed images was of course the Admiral's family, with most of them featuring James, Nia, the Admiral, and the older grey-haired and tired-looking man that she'd suspected to be James's Uncle Flynn, the Admiral's brother. In the pictures they looked younger on, they usually stood together as a close group and always had some sort of bodily contact, with their arms either wrapped around each other or at least somewhat leaning or otherwise placed on one another, while they all smiled directly into the camera. However, the older they seemed to get, the more of a separation seemed to form, with James and his mother standing further and further apart, seemingly leaving the other two with having to choose a side while also trying to bridge the gap between them. And finally, on the photos on which they looked closest to what they looked like today, it seemed that only one of them was ever displayed at a time, either James or his mother, while the other two still remained featured on most of them. She'd have guessed that must have either been right around the time that his mother decided to take a more active part in James's life, or after he had left the military. It was hard to say for sure. Some pictures also broke the mold of the others and were a bit more unique, standing out among the rest whenever they showed up on one of the frames. One seemed to be a big celebration, likely a graduation of sorts, with James up on the stage above some sort of crowd. A similar one was also there for Nia. Another one showed Flynn and a very young-looking James in front of a large house with a huge fence around, and behind it enclosing a truly enormous area, while the two humans posed widely, gesturing towards the building with all their might with beaming faces. More pictures then featured this same location, usually involving either James or Flynn together with large predatory-looking animals, none of which Shida could identify, although she still felt like none of them looked like something a child of that age should be around at all. Yet the younger James seemed not in the slightest perturbed by their presence, usually either petting them or carrying them around without a care in the world. Something Shida noticed after continued observation of the rotating pictures, after a while, was that there was a notable absence of pictures of Nia prior to a certain age, and she wondered if that was an indication of the time that the girl had been adopted into James's family. However, based purely on James's and Nia's explanations, it had always sounded like she had to have been a good bit younger than the first pictures of her that started to show up within the picture frames. Then again, it was possible that Shada had just misunderstood them in that regard. Or maybe she was just a lot worse at judging human ages based on pictures than she thought she was. It was only now that Shada realised that she had gone and done the exact thing that she had tried to avoid before, and had gotten totally distracted. And she only realised this because Admiral Krieger deliberately tapped onto the table's plate with the edge of her tablet 2 times, causing Shada's ears to twitch in the direction of the noise, and pulling her out of her concentrated state, making her shoot around to look at the Admiral, while all at once sitting up a lot straighter in her seat. The Admiral looked at her with a near expressionless face for a few seconds, before her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and just the right corner of her mouth twitched upwards in the faintest hint of a smirk. "Well, this all looks acceptable so far, Shada," Admiral Krieger informed her, putting the tablet down flat onto the table and slightly rolling back in her chair, reaching for one of the desk drawers without looking, while keeping up eye contact. "Although I have to admit, you not having a surname is giving our system some troubles. I had to manually tell the forms to ignore those required fields." "Sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am," Shada replied, unsure of what to say to that. While she was of course familiar with the concept of a surname, it was still slightly strange to her. One had also never been necessary in her military career so far. However, the human military had not yet adapted all their forms and contracts to a general standard, as their military had not been fully conformed to the communal one yet. A lucky fact, as it had by now turned out, but inconvenient for her personally in this specific situation. Admiral Krieger raised a single eyebrow, and the corner of her mouth twitched once again while she asked, "What are you apologizing for? Did you get rid of your surname specifically to mess with our systems?" Shada's ears stood straight up, and she restrainedly shook her head in mild confusion. Of course not, ma'am," she replied, unsure of the turn this conversation had taken. However, the Admiral merely nodded, looking into Shada's eyes with her piercing gaze for a second longer, before briefly turning away to look into the drawer she had opened, instead of rummaging through it blindly for any longer. Apparently, she wasn't intending on elaborating any further. Instead, she pulled a small, shiny black object out of the drawer and placed it on the desk right before Shada. "I'd like you to have this," she explained, pushing it even closer towards Shada with the tips of her white, slender fingers. "From now on, I think it would be better if you were easy to reach at all times, so please keep it turned on, and on your person whenever possible." Shada leaned forward slightly to look down at the shiny object. It looked like James's phone that he had given her back on the station, just thinner and with a slightly different design, making it look almost like a black hand mirror. Carefully she reached out, picking the small object up from the table and weighing its flat form in her hands. It was a bit heavier than it looked, but the weight seemed well balanced for what it was. "As your biometric data is in our system now, it should already recognize you. Try activating it by putting your finger on the sensor on the back," the Admiral kept explaining, while Shada still looked down at the phone, which to her seemed like an expensive piece of tech. Well, maybe not expensive, but certainly not cheap, especially when compared to the rather simple and blocky personal assistance she was used to. Quickly, she did as she was told, pushing her finger against the sensor, which immediately made the screen come to life with a crisp, bright light. "I've had it set to you for you, and I've also taken the liberty to pre-save some contacts you most likely want to have already," the Admiral continued, while Shada fascinatedly studied the screen, intrigued by finally being able to understand what most of the strange symbols meant, based on the text displayed alongside them. "And try to get familiar with it. I will have someone contact you soon about the next steps of your application. You should also expect someone from Mars representing your interest to get in touch with you in the near future. Understood?" Shada still wasn't entirely sure how okay it was for her to accept this. However, it was far from her to turn down basically anything she got for free. "Yes, ma'am," Shada replied, and looked back up to indicate that she had actually been listening and not just been enamored by her new toy. Admiral Krieger studied her for a few seconds, with barely noticeable movements of her eyes, her lips ever so slightly moving back and forth as she seemingly tensed and relaxed them a few times. Finally, she nodded once more, and lifted her hand to gesture right through Shada, away from the table and towards the door. "In that case, I would ask you to take your leave now," she stated calmly. "If you have any important questions, feel free to contact any of the appropriate resources you can find in the phone." Shada immediately got to her feet, pushing the chair away with the backs of her legs in the process. "Of course, ma'am," she replied, taking a brief bow before starting to step away from the table. "Success to you, She barely managed to catch herself within the act of using the phrase she had been taught to use in situations like these for years automatically, clearing her throat to interrupt herself in the middle of her sentence, while the Admiral briefly glanced at her. "Good day, Shada," the Admiral then said, her tone somehow sounding like she was smiling despite her lips remaining unmoved on her face. "Good day, ma'am," Shada repeated back at her, thankful for what she assumed to be a nudge in the right direction. Then, before she could make any more blunders, she quickly turned towards the door and left with her head held high and her hand tightly closed around her newly acquired phone. Once she had left the room, she stopped for a moment and took a deep breath before looking down at the device once again. Helpfully, the first thing it did was inform her of the current time, or at least the current EGT, which was 7:24. A lot earlier than she usually managed to drag herself out of bed, but since she knew about her earlier appointment today, she had simply slept through most of yesterday to prepare for it, which meant that she wasn't too tired. Next, she checked the contacts option on the screen, wondering what kind of contacts had been pre-saved for her. Most of them were different services of the ship, likely those she would need to contact one way or another sooner or later in more advanced stages of the process of her application. However, others included James, Nia, and even the Admiral herself, although Shada was quite sure that she would avoid calling that contact unless absolutely necessary. 4 other contacts curiously turned out to be those of James's old team, even though Shada didn't know why the Admiral expected her to want any of them as a contact. And finally, Shada could only guess at the identity of the last contact, although the addition of Doctor before the name made her think that it was probably some sort of physician. Dr. May Tracy. As Shada wasn't in need of a physician at the moment, she opted to ignore the oddity for now, but made a mental note to ask about it at some point. Maybe she would need to go for a physical checkup. Still, she felt like she should probably test if this new phone of hers worked as intended, as well as maybe get some input on its functions from someone with experience, so she called the one contact she felt like she would probably not disturb too much, in doing so without prior notice. And with this, you can get news that have been specifically curated for you. But if you ask me, just getting the news you would seek out anyway kind of defeats the point, Nia explained, leaning quite closely into Shada's personal space to point directly at one of the symbols on the small screen of the phone. They were sitting in one of the many cafeterias aboard the Sun. It was pretty empty around this time of day, giving the large room filled with rows and rows of tables and benches an almost ominous feeling. Both the tables and the benches were made of blank, easily cleanable metal, and fastened to the smooth white floor with heavy bolts. Shada nodded attentively and pressed onto the symbol absent-mindedly, just to test it out. They're going to be quite random at first while the algorithm figures out how you tick and what you're interested in. Nia continued her explanation and pulled back, giving Shada some room again. Theoretically, you can help it out by telling it which articles you'd like to read, and which ones you didn't find interesting and so on, but I don't think I've ever met anyone who actually does that. Shada nodded again, feeling like she also can be bothered to give feedback for any article she read while she was bored, as her eyes slowly looked over the different headlines of the articles that were supposedly recommended for her. As Nia had warned her, they were indeed seemingly random, reaching across all kinds of generally popular topics without taking her specific interests into account. It reached from news about random celebrities she had never heard of, to things that Shada wouldn't consider news at all, like for example some things she could only describe as advertisements for vacations on certain planets or stations. And of course, news of the current situation in the galaxy were also among them, talking about the effects of humanity and their neighbours closing their borders, and the different statements of council members addressing the recent accusations and predictions for the upcoming election. Shada wasn't planning to read any of this right now, and so she quickly moved to close the application again, when a brief moment of recognition made her pause mid-movement. Her eyes zeroed in on the headline, in which she thought to have seen a familiar name. It read, "Candidate Quiz urges homeworld Nucenity against neutrality in Orion conflict." Shada paused again. Candidate Quiz? Pressing her finger onto the headline, the picture of a very familiar Andala suddenly appeared on the screen. Underneath, she could read the first few sentences of the article. Gebelitin. Despite being a rather obscure figure on the larger galactic stage so far, the currently on the core world Gebelitin residing candidate for the open seat in the Galactic Council, Quiz of the Andalia people, has brought the core world's attention onto themselves yesterday, as they addressed their homeworld of Nucenity in an open letter, urging them to not remain neutral on the current conflict in the Orion Arm. Shada nearly dropped the phone, her hand clenching tightly around it as soon as she felt it slipping out of her grasp, which quickly gained Nia's attention. Is something the matter? She asked, tilting her head to the side and lifting her eyebrows concernedly, as she tried to decipher what on the phone screen had Shada reacting so strangely, some braids of her hair falling to the side as she did so. "I gotta show this to everyone," Shada mumbled absent-mindedly, getting up from her seat before she had even answered Nia. "Show what?" Nia asked, also getting to her feet, clearly more worried than annoyed about being ignored like that. Shada handed the phone over and briefly reminded Nia who Chris was, and Nia had never met them before, and only knew them from her and more stories. All the while, the two already started walking out of the cafeteria, Shada taking the lead despite not really having an idea where she was even going. She had to show this to everyone, but she had no idea where everyone was. Well, all things considered, Moore was most likely in her room. She didn't wander around too much. But if she was being honest, she didn't exactly want to talk to Moore first of all people, which was admittedly a bit selfish, since out of all of them, the old woman knew Chris by far the best. Still, Shada couldn't shake her desire to talk to either Curie or James first, before taking on the task of bearing the news to Moore. However, there was still the issue of him being busy all the time, but he would likely want to know about that. She was quite sure. So he probably wouldn't mind a brief interruption, if he would mind at all. If only she knew where he was right now. Suddenly, with a look back at the phone that was still in Nia's hands, Shada realized that she now didn't need to know where James was to reach him anymore. By now, Shada felt like she could find her way around her neighborhood aboard the Sun reasonably well, and so it didn't take long until she arrived at the door down the hall, far to the right and down the hall again, that was labelled with Dojo, whatever that meant. Of course, overall, she had likely seen less than 1% of the gigantic ship so far, but at least she didn't get lost in her immediate area anymore after a few days on board. The door was already open, and so Shada and Nia could easily peer inside of the room. It was a good bit smaller than most rooms on the ship intended for general use, and the walls and floor were also quite different, as they seemed to be covered in somewhat soft, bluish matting all over, almost giving the room a childproof look. And immediately, the two were treated to the image of James being nearly forced to the floor, his head and arms stuck between Captain Anderson's legs, as she pulled his head downwards while she herself held onto one of his legs, helping her to pull on it even harder. The position looked uncomfortable in a multitude of ways, and apparently James agreed, because it didn't take long of him being stuck in it before he decided to tap out, at which the blonde tower of a woman immediately loosened her hold and elegantly slipped off of him. All the while James held onto her, to make sure that she wouldn't land flat on her back while disentangling herself from the complicated-looking chokehold. "Honestly, I'm not sure if I should be happy that you're getting your old muscles back again," Anderson commented, as soon as she had solid ground on her feet again, while James seemingly needed to catch his breath for a moment, leaning down with his hands on his knees. "It was fun being able to put you on your ass as long as it lasted." James coughed for a second and shook out his head before he answered. "Not like you ever had too much trouble beating me in sparring." The captain took a second to stretch while James recovered, replying with a slight strain in her voice. "Yeah, emphasis on in sparring. Things would look quite a bit different if you were actually trying to hurt me, so it was fun doing it legit for once." James just made a dismissive noise, apparently still too out of breath to actively argue with her. The two were surrounded by the rest of the team, who so far held a respectful distance to the sparring duo, but now slowly stepped closer since the two were done for the moment. "Seriously though," a green-haired woman with quite different features that Shada hadn't been specifically introduced to yet chimed in, crossing her arms in front of her chest. "How are you already this fit again? Just days ago you could barely get through the warm-ups, and now you're still standing after a flying triangle." James brought his right hand to his forehead, wiping upwards to both remove sweat and slick his hair backwards, although it was still too short to actually hang on his face at this time. "The wonders of modern medicine," he replied with a slightly annoyed sound and started to rotate his shoulder that had been stuck in the hole previously. "Our Gentech has advantages apart from just not getting cancer anymore, you know." The woman scoffed, clearly not quite buying what he was selling. "I know that," she said almost scornfully. "Still, I wouldn't have results like that after this short of a time, and we've got the same enhancements." James now finally completely stood up, and started turning his neck, pushing with his hand against his chin, until it let out an audible crack. "Well, what can I say?" he mused and shrugged, while tilting his head left to right for a bit longer. "Testosterone's one hell of a drug." "You can say that again?" Nia suddenly injected herself into the conversation from beside Shada, after apparently being done standing by and observing the quite interesting scene. Everyone's head shot around towards the two recently arrived women. James immediately started to walk towards them with a wide smile, happily greeting, "Hey, you two." Although, despite his happy face, it didn't get past Shada that he once again half hid his right arm behind his body, despite using it openly and indiscriminately earlier. Still, he otherwise didn't seem to be behaving any differently when he briefly hugged both of them in a quick greeting, before taking a step back and looking at them expectantly, asking, "So, what is it you wanted to show me?" Shada quickly showed him the article she stumbled upon earlier, while the rest of James's former team formed up behind, slowly closing in a semicircle formation to try and get a glimpse at whatever he was looking at. Everyone except the green-haired one, that was. She kept a bit more distance, standing slightly aside with her arms still crossed. "Huh, well, ain't that something?" James mumbled while reading over the first lines of the article, clearly quite engrossed in the text of the screen, while concern grew on his face. While he was busy, Nia suddenly stepped away from Shada's side, walking around the huddled-up group of humans and approaching the woman, still standing aside with an outstretched hand. "I don't think we've been introduced yet," she explained, which surprised Shada since Nia had seemed so familiar with everyone else so far. "I'm Nia. It's nice to meet you." The green-haired one seemed to be considering her options for a moment, before loosening one of her arms and shaking Nia's hand. "Tuya," she introduced herself, forgoing her rank or surname in the introduction, despite including those seemingly being the common practice on the ship. "I'm your brother's replacement." "No the fuck you aren't," Admit suddenly yelled out, apparently listening quite attentively to everything around him, despite being focused on the story right in front of him. He stood up straighter and turned around to look directly at the woman, pointing at her face with his right pointer finger. "You are a new teammate, completely separate from James. Will you please stop it with this whole original or replacement BS? Then he took his hand down and immediately turned forward again, leaving Tuya to stand there and shake her head and roll her eyes, while the rest of the team briefly chuckled at his flamboyant display. However, she still changed her tune as he asked, rephrasing her earlier statement. "Fine. I'm the new teammate that was employed after your brother quit." Personally, Shada didn't really see the difference between the two statements, if she was being honest. However, it seemed that not only Admir, but also Nia was quite satisfied with the new, rephrased version of her introduction, and Nia happily said, "Well, it is very nice to make your acquaintance, Tuya." "Likewise," Tuya replied with a smile, before her attention turned onto her team plus James curiously, now apparently not quite so distant anymore. "So, what have you even brought us there?" Nia apparently knew very well that she didn't even need to bother answering, and instead she just pointed at James. Sure enough, it didn't take long before he started to mumble. "Well, it looks like I'm not the only one who has stepped onto the political playing field." He looked concerned, with his eyebrows sinking deep into his face above his narrow eyes as he seemingly read the last parts of the article. "I just hope they're being careful," he finally stated, lifting his gaze again and handing the phone back to Shada. "They don't have the kind of backup I do, and I'm not even feeling confident in this." "Well, not much you can do about it," Amy stated with a shrug, as everyone took a few steps back to allow James to have some personal space once again. "If they think this is what's best, then let them," Captain Anderson concurred with her colleague while running a hand through her long ponytail. "You can't make everything your problem, and they're old enough to make their own decision from what it seems." James sighed. "They can't exactly keep me from worrying," he said over his shoulder, before fully focusing on Shada. "What did Moore have to say about this?" Shada sheepishly scratched the tip of her foot across the floor, and let one of her ears hang down. "Actually, I haven't told you yet," she admitted. I looked up at James with only her eyes while slightly letting her head hang. James seemed surprised. "Why not?" he asked candidly, his forehead showing deep folds as his eyebrows lifted up high. She'd bit her lower lip, revealing a single long fang in the process. "Well, all things considered, I thought we should maybe tell her together," she explained, which wasn't exactly the first reason she could think of, but definitely one of them. "I thought it might be better if it's not just me and her." Admittedly, her and Moore were getting along a lot better ever since being stuck in a small ship together for a couple of weeks, but that still didn't mean that they were very excited about private moments together, and she'd imagined that it would be even worse if such a serious topic was involved. James scowled unsurely, looking like he knew what she was talking about, but also knew that he was of no help as he glanced up at the only part of the wall that didn't have any matting as it displayed the time of day. "I'm going to be occupied for the rest of the day," he half-stated, half-grumbled, in a clearly dissatisfied manner, or clearly doing some math in his head as he studied the time. "I'm probably going to have to bring this up in a strategy meeting as well, if it doesn't come up by itself. It's going to be the dead of night before I have the time to sit down with her." "Yeah, I understand," Sheila said, and couldn't quite keep disappointment from creeping into her voice, although she honestly did understand. She knew why he didn't have time. She just kind of wished it wasn't so. "We probably shouldn't keep her in the dark that long." James nodded in agreement, although the frown on his face told of him not being entirely happy with that conclusion. Sorry, he said, sounding painfully honest, even though it was no fault of his. Well, I can always go with you, Nia chimed in, trying to break up some of the gloom that threatened to take over the conversation. She looked back at her and tried to look thankful, but managed little more than a half-hearted smile, and from the corner of her eyes she could see that James did the same. Yeah, I know, Sheila then said, an awkwardly ruffle through her own hair around her nape. But you don't really know Chris, so it's going to be harder for you to calm more down. Nia pursed her lips as her eyes looked down and to the right contemplatively. Meanwhile, James chimed in once again, asking, And what about Curie? Have you told them yet? Sheila shook her head while she turned back towards James. No, not yet. Do you know where they are? I haven't seen them in a while. James once again raised his eyebrows, highly in surprise. I thought they were with you, he said, his eyebrows slowly sinking down into a concerned expression. I haven't seen them in a while either. They exchanged worried glances, as they had apparently both falsely assumed that the other was keeping tabs on Curie. But the tension was quickly broken up by the Major suddenly chiming into their conversation. No reason to get all anxious. They can hardly have gotten lost, the long-haired man with the blood-red eyes explained, putting one hand on James's shoulder while openly gesturing with the other one. Wherever they go, they are going to stand out to everyone around them. Besides, the ship isn't that hard to navigate, and from what I understand, your cybernetic friend isn't that dumb. No. Curie indeed wasn't dumb. Well, actually, that kind of depended on one's definition of being dumb, but navigation usually wasn't one of their problems. It was indeed unlikely that Curie had somehow managed to get so lost that it posed a risk to their health, just because someone wasn't looking after them at all times. They weren't a toddler, after all. Still, it was odd, to say the least, that they seemingly hadn't even tried to talk to James despite his new situation. She'd had expected that he would have had a hard time getting a moment of pause from the cyborg after his surgery, and instead, the opposite had seemingly happened. While he tried to hide his arm from her whenever possible, certainly the same wouldn't be true for Curie, would it? Suddenly, Tuya piped up once more, tilting her head to the side and lifting a single eyebrow as she said, Isn't Curie the spider thing that hangs around at Mid-Enge the whole time? She simultaneously asked and offered an answer. If you can't find them, they're probably there. What are they doing in Mid-Enge? Captain Anderson asked with a confused look over to her colleague. However, Adme took it upon himself to reply, claiming, Well, getting upgrades of course, or maybe repairs, something like that. While she doubted that either of those would be necessary given the advancement of Curie's body, hanging around the medical engineering area of the ship did at least sound like something plausible for Curie to do, even if that still left some questions unanswered. The better question is, what were you doing in Mid-Enge? Major suddenly asked, turning towards Tuya and fixating her with a curious gaze. Tuya just shrugged, looking back at him placidly and replying, I help out there sometimes. Nothing complicated, of course, just sticking wires and soldering and stuff like that. Anything that doesn't require surgical precision. And, well, the cyborg buddy is also working on something down there, together with one of the doctors. Maybe they're really getting an upgrade, who knows. Doesn't look like repairs, though. Sheila looked over at James, asking him with just her gaze if he had any idea what they were doing. And James replied, also in a single gaze, that no, he had absolutely no clue. Yet somehow, based on the way his eyes quivered as he looked back at her, it seemed all but certain that his therapist would hear about this.